coffee mug explodes across the ER floor at Iron Ridge Military Medical Center, and the laughter that follows is the kind that leaves marks. 6 Navy operators in full kit shaking with it. The target of the joke is a 29-year-old nurse crouched on the tile, quietly picking up the pieces with bare hands. "You're not a sniper, sweetheart. You're just a nurse." Claire Donovan doesn't look up, doesn't flinch. The blood from the ceramic slicing her palm drips onto the floor, and she wraps her hand in gauze and keeps moving. Before dawn, those same men will be begging her to save their lives. If this story already has you hooked, follow along until the very end. Hit like, and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story can travel. The shift started at 05:30, and by 05:45, Claire Donovan had already restocked the crash carts, updated 3 patient charts, and quietly caught a medication dosage error that would have sent a 62-year-old post-op veteran into cardiac arrest. She flagged it through the attending physician, corrected the order, and moved on without mentioning it again. That was how she worked. Without noise. Without waiting for someone to notice. Silver Creek, Montana. In January was the kind of cold that got inside your bones and didn't leave until April. Iron Ridge Military Medical Center sat at the edge of a federal training installation, a brutalist concrete structure expanded twice in the last decade that still somehow felt cramped. The ER was controlled chaos most mornings. Soldiers cycling through with training injuries. Contractors. The occasional civilian brought in from the highway after the ICE made decisions for them. Claire had worked the unit for 11 months. She knew every supply cabinet, every monitor quirk, every physician's preference for how they wanted their trauma bay arranged, and every nurse on the floor well enough to cover their blind spots before they realized they had one. What she didn't talk about was everything before that. Her locker held a single photograph tucked behind her spare stethoscope. A younger version of herself in desert gear, somewhere that didn't have a name on any public map, covered in dust, rifle across her back, surrounded by 6 men in similar condition, all of them grinning. She was not. She looked directly into the camera with the flat, settled expression of someone who had already processed the worst thing that happened that day and simply moved past it. She'd taped a piece of brown paper over the photo years ago. She didn't need to see it. She remembered every face in it without trying. The operators arrived at 06:10. 6 of them came through the main entrance with the specific energy of men who had never once been made to feel unwelcome anywhere. They were attached to a special operations unit out of Fort Calloway, running a 3-week joint training cycle with the installation. Iron Ridge had been designated as their medical support facility, which meant Claire's ER was now also, functionally, their waiting room, their break space, and apparently their personal entertainment venue. Their team leader was Staff Sergeant Derek Hargrove. 34 years old, built like a man who had decided early in life that physical size was a form of argument and had spent 15 years winning debates. He walked into the trauma bay like he owned the square footage and every piece of equipment bolted to it. "Who's the charge nurse?" he asked, not directing it at anyone in particular. Claire was at the medication station with her back to him. "That would be me." He looked at her. Then he looked at the man beside him, a wiry specialist everyone called Tuck, and something passed between them that didn't need words. "All right," Hargrove said. "We need a full supply inventory, pain management, hemostatic agents, airway equipment, whatever you've got on hand." "I can pull that together," Claire said. Give me 20 minutes." "I was thinking 10. She turned to face him. "Then you'll get an incomplete list." Another look between Hargrove and Tuck. This time Tuck smiled. She gave them 22 minutes. The list was complete. The first 2 days were friction. Not the dramatic kind, just the low-grade constant variety that grinds on you the way a small stone in your boot does over a long march. Hargrove's team occupied space with the ease of men who assumed it was theirs to occupy. They left equipment in wrong positions. They talked over the nursing staff during briefings. A broad-shouldered operator named Solace once moved an IV stand out of his way without asking and didn't replace it, which wouldn't have been a problem except that stand was prepped for a patient scheduled in 40 minutes. Claire repositioned it without comment and documented the incident in the unit log. Her colleague Marcus, a night shift RN who had done 2 Army tours before earning his nursing degree, watched her absorb 3 days of low-level disrespect with the expression of a man watching someone defuse a device he wasn't sure was actually safe. "You're not going to say something to them?" he asked on the third evening, leaning against the nurse's station, while Hargrove's team replayed training footage loudly on a phone in the waiting area. "Nothing to say yet," Claire answered, without looking up from her charting. "Claire, Tuck called you the help this morning." "I heard him." "And?" "I wrote it in the log." Marcus stared at her. "Most people, when they're getting treated like that, they either blow up or they go quiet and start making mistakes." "I know." "You just keep moving." "Yes?" He shook his head slowly. "I genuinely cannot tell if that's discipline or something else entirely." "Go home, Marcus. You've been here 14 hours. He went. She stayed. The coffee mug happened on day 4. It wasn't premeditated. One of the junior operators, a kid named Pellew, who couldn't have been more than 22, had brought a travel mug from off-post and left it on the edge of the supply counter while he wandered the unit. Claire moved it to make room for a supply tray. She set it closer to the edge than she'd realized. When Pellew came back for his jacket, his elbow caught it on the way past. The mug hit the floor and shattered. The sound pulled Hargrove and 2 others into the doorway. "The hell happened?" Hargrove said. Pellew pointed at Claire. She moved it. That was the moment. Not dramatic, not planned, just a 22-year-old kid pointing a finger because it was the easiest available option. Claire was already crouching to collect the pieces. "Careful," Hargrove said in a tone that wasn't concern. "Wouldn't want our nurse to hurt herself." Tuck laughed. Solis added, "Somebody find her a broom." "She's not a janitor," Pellew offered, which was the closest thing to a defense anyone produced. "No," Hargrove agreed. "She's a nurse." He said the word the way some people say filing clerk. Dismissive. Final. Like the job title itself was an explanation for everything. Not a lot of distance between the two in a place like this. Claire's palm found a ceramic shard. She felt the sting, assessed it without looking at not deep, won't need sutures, and kept picking up pieces. "You're not even going to respond?" Hargrove asked. He sounded almost curious, maybe disappointed. "What would you like me to say, Staff Sergeant?" "Something with some backbone." She stood up, broken pieces wrapped in a paper towel, and looked at him directly. "I'd like your team to stop using this corridor as a social space. The trauma bay is a working environment. There's a day room on the 2nd floor if you need somewhere to wait between training cycles." Silence. Then Hargrove smiled. Not a kind one. "Yes, ma'am," he said, with enough irony to fill the room twice. They didn't move to the 2nd floor. But they stopped laughing. By Saturday, something had shifted in ways that were difficult to name. Hargrove's team was still present, still loud, still operating with that particular brand of arrogance that comes from being genuinely dangerous and knowing it. But they'd started watching her. Not the way people watch someone they respect, not anything close to that, more the way they observe something that isn't behaving according to their model of the world, and they haven't yet figured out what to do with that. Claire noticed. She noticed most things. What she noticed more urgently on that Saturday morning was the medic attached to Hargrove's unit, a young sergeant named Bird who had been running training scenarios since 0400, came in to resupply around 0900. His hands were steady, his voice was even, but his pupils were slightly unequal, and he had a habit of touching the left side of his head near his temple every few minutes without appearing to know he was doing it. Claire set down what she was carrying and walked to where he was working at the supply cabinet. "Sergeant Bird," he turned. "Ma'am." "When did you last sleep?" "Last night." "How many hours?" "Enough." That's not an answer. He exhaled through his nose. 4, maybe a little less. We had a 200 briefing. "You took contact during yesterday's OPFOR exercise." His expression shifted. It was controlled. Padded gear, simulated. "You've touched your left temple 11 times since you walked through that door," Claire said. "Are you having pressure behind your eyes? Any visual disturbance?" A pause. "Some pressure, nothing serious. Come with me." "Ma'am, I've got resupply to finish, and then I need to get back out." "Sergeant." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It just became precise in a way that left no room for negotiation. "Come with me." He came. The neurological screen took 12 minutes. Not rushed, not mechanical. The kind of assessment built from repetition in environments where the margin between catching something and missing it was someone's life. She walked him through each component with the same flat focus she brought to everything. Bird was cooperative. He was also, she could see, trying to minimize the way trained people do when they don't want to be the reason the mission changes. Grade 2 concussion, she said when she finished. You're done for today. Staff Sergeant Hargrove is going to... I'll handle Staff Sergeant Hargrove. Right now you sit down. She found Hargrove in the corridor, exactly where she'd expected, arms crossed, watching the exam room through the window. Your medic has a concussion, she said. He's grounded for the day. He looked functional to me. He was masking it. That's what your people do. I understand the instinct, but if he takes another hit before this clears, we're having a different conversation in this building, and it won't be a short one. Hargrove studied her, a longer look than he'd given her before. You got all that from watching him touch his own head. Among other things, something moved behind his eyes. Not respect, not yet, but the first fracture in the certainty. A small one, and he covered it quickly, but she saw it. Fine, he said. 1 day. 2 days minimum. We reassess Monday morning. His jaw tightened. You always push like this? When the situation calls for it. He walked away without answering. He didn't argue the 2 days. Bird stayed. Sunday started quiet the way military medical facilities get quiet. Not peaceful, just braced. The overnight crew had left notes on 2 post-op patients to monitor and a potential issue with the portable defibrillator in Bay 3. Claire handled both before 700 and had started on her morning charts when Pellew appeared at the nurse's station. He stood there for a moment, not saying anything, which was already different from every other interaction she'd had with any of them. Pellew, she said, not looking up. Something I can do for you? I wanted to say something about the mug, he said. The way it came out. I didn't mean for it to go like that. She looked up. He was young. She'd clocked it before. But without his team around him, he looked it more. Like the posture they required of him was something he was still learning to hold all the time, and in its absence, he was just a kid who'd made a mistake in front of people and felt bad about it. It wasn't a big deal, he said, which they both understood was not quite true. Sit down, she said. He sat. He looked like he hadn't been told to sit in a professional context in his entire adult life and wasn't sure if it was punishment. How long have you been in? She asked. 26 months? And Hargrove's the best operator you've ever worked alongside. Not a question. He answered it anyway. Yes, ma'am. So you follow his lead. That's how you get good. You find someone better than you and you pay close attention. The problem is that his lead includes some things that have nothing to do with effectiveness and everything to do with comfort. And comfort tends to have a cost. Pellew sat with that, then, does it bother you, the way they talk to you? Yes, she said simply. He looked startled, like he'd expected a different kind of answer. It bothers me, she continued, and then I do my job. Both things are true at the same time. She clicked her pen closed. Get some sleep before this afternoon. You look like you've been running sprints in your own head. He almost smiled. Yes, ma'am. He left. She watched him go and turned back to her charts. Whatever was fracturing in that unit, it had started. She didn't know yet what shape it would take when it broke open. The call came in at 13:47, a training exercise 3 miles from the installation, live fire scenario with a vehicle component. The first radio transmission was fragmented, bad signal through the ridge terrain. But the phrase multiple casualties came through clean and then critical, and the line deteriorated, and the next thing Claire heard was the unit coordinator's voice over the floor intercom, carrying that particular flatness that people train into themselves for exactly these moments, because the alternative is not useful. All ER staff to positions. Mass casualty event inbound. ETA 8 minutes. Count is 4, possibly 5. Nature of injuries? Blunt trauma, possible crush, at least 1 respiratory compromise reported in the field. Claire was already moving before the announcement finished. She called positions without raising her voice. Crash cart to Bay 1. Respiratory team to Bay 2. She confirmed the defibrillator in Bay 3 was functional. It was. The morning issue had been a loose cable, fixed at O643, and she pulled the trauma supply rack into the center corridor where it could reach any of the first 3 bays without being repositioned. 91 seconds from announcement to ready state. She counted it without thinking about it, the way she counted everything. Hargrove came through the side entrance at 13:49, moving fast. He was bleeding from a cut above his left eye, shirt dark with blood that wasn't his. His face was locked down, controlled, professional, the mask that men like him trained for years to hold under pressure. But his eyes were doing something different, and Claire read it in the first second she saw him. Not panic. Something more specific than panic. The look of a man who is very good at what he does and has just encountered something that exceeded the boundaries of what that means. He crossed the bay and stopped directly in front of her. 4 of my men, he said. His voice was level. His hands were not. Vehicle rolled on the descent. One of them went under the chassis before it stopped. One of them... He stopped. Reset. One of them stopped breathing in the field. They got a pulse back, but it was weak, and they couldn't hold it. Claire held his gaze. How long ago? 11 minutes from the event. They've been moving since then. What's the road condition between here and there? 2 sections of ice. They're pushing speed, but the doors at the far end of the corridor burst open. The first gurney came through moving fast, 2 soldiers pushing it, a third running alongside with manual pressure on something she couldn't see yet. The patient was a male, mid-20s, head wound bleeding through improvised field dressing, left arm at an angle that told her the radius was broken before she reached him. She was already there. Talk to me, she said to the soldier maintaining pressure. Skull impact on the roll. He was conscious for 4 minutes, then he went out. Pulse is there, weak, breathing's irregular. Bay 1. She moved with the gurney. BP monitor. I need a cuff on him now and get neurology on the phone, not a page, a phone call. The second gurney came in 40 seconds behind the first. This one was worse. The patient was a male, older, and the lower half of his body told the story of what had happened under that vehicle. Both legs had been compressed. The field dressing on his left thigh was soaked through, and whoever had applied it had done the right thing. Tourniquet high and tight, applied correctly. But his color was wrong, and his breathing was the shallow, fast pattern of a body that was losing the argument with blood loss. Hargrove was 3 steps behind the gurney. That's Reyes, he said. He's my best... He stopped himself. He's critical. I can see that, Claire said, and she moved to Reyes without finishing the sentence because there was nothing in that sentence that would help either of them. She had a needle in his arm in 8 seconds, called for O negative, called the blood pressure reading from the monitor and adjusted her estimate of his volume status in real time. The tourniquet had bought them time. How much depended on what was happening above it that she couldn't see yet? And she was already thinking about the imaging sequence and the surgical consult and the specific order in which the next 6 decisions needed to happen. The 3rd and 4th casualties arrived together. One was ambulatory, walking wounded, hand pressed to his own ribs, breathing in the careful, measured way people do when they've cracked something and they're afraid of what a full breath will feel like. The other was not ambulatory, carried in by 2 of his teammates, unconscious, with the particular stillness that made everyone in the room instinctively move faster. Bay 3, Claire said, pointing at the unconscious one. Full team. Now. She turned to find Hargrove standing at the edge of the bay. He had stopped moving. He was looking at his men, all 4 of them, in various states of crisis, in a room that had shifted from controlled to maximum capacity in under 3 minutes. And his face had done something she hadn't seen from him before. He looked lost, not helpless, not incompetent, just outside the range of what he had trained for. He was built for the field. He was built for decisions made at speed with a weapon in his hands and his team at his back. He was not built for standing still while the people he was responsible for disappeared behind curtains and monitors and strangers and scrubs. He looked at Claire. And for the first time since he'd walked into her ER, the look he gave her wasn't dismissal or amusement or appraisal. It was something closer to, I need you to be as good as you seem right now. She didn't acknowledge it. There wasn't time. Hargrove, she said without looking up from Reyes's chart, either scrub in or get behind that line and stay there. Those are your options. He stepped back behind the line. She moved to Bay 3. The unconscious soldier's name was Quan. She got that from the dog tags before she got it from anyone's mouth. His airway was partially compromised, not fully, but moving in that direction, and his chest X-ray, which she called for immediately, was going to show her something she already suspected from the way the left side of his chest moved slightly differently than the right when the room's negative pressure caught a breath. She was right. Pneumothorax. Left side. Not tension yet, but building. "I need a chest kit," she said, "and I need the room quiet." The room went quiet. She worked. Outside the bay, she was dimly aware of Hargrove's voice, low, controlled, talking to someone on a cell phone. Talking to command, she guessed. Reporting. That was the right thing to do. She had no complaints about that. What she was focused on was the needle in her hand and the precise location on Quan's chest wall where it needed to go, and the sound she was listening for that would tell her the pressure was releasing, and the feel of the resistance changing under her fingers as she worked. There it was. A rush of air. Quan's left chest wall dropped back into its normal pattern. His oxygen saturation, which had been sliding toward a number she didn't want to see, reversed course on the monitor. Claire exhaled once. Not dramatically, just a breath. "Get me the tube," she said. "We're going to keep this stable." 40 minutes later, all 4 casualties were alive, monitored, and moving towards stable. Reyes was in surgery. He'd been wheeled up to the OR at the 18-minute mark, and the surgical team had everything they needed because Claire had called ahead with a complete status report before they'd even fully prepped the room. Quan was breathing on supplemental oxygen with the chest tube draining cleanly. The head trauma case was in imaging with neuro standing by. The rib fracture was taped and medicated and sitting upright in Bay 2, telling whoever would listen that he was fine and could go back to duty, which no one was taking seriously. Claire was updating the surgical notes at the nurse's station when Hargrove appeared beside her. He didn't say anything for a moment. She kept writing. "Reyes," he said finally. "What are his chances?" "As surgery," she said. "But he came in with a pulse and the right interventions were done in the right order in the right window. Those things matter." Hargrove nodded. He was still holding it together, but whatever composure cost him, it was costing him more now than it had this morning. "You knew what to do," he said. "All of it, in the right order, without hesitating." "That's my job, Staff Sergeant." He looked at her. "That's not just nursing school." She didn't answer. "Where did you—" "The patient in Bay 2 is asking for his commanding officer," she said. "He's medicated but stable. You can see him for 5 minutes." Hargrove stood there another second. Then he nodded and walked toward Bay 2. At the door, he stopped. He didn't turn around. "I'm sorry about the mug," he said. His voice was flat. No performance in it. Claire looked up from her notes, but he was already gone through the curtain. She sat with that for a moment, then she turned back to her work. Outside the window, the January sky over Silver Creek had gone the dark purple-gray of late afternoon, and the temperature on the external display read 17 degrees and falling. Somewhere on the second floor, a surgery was in progress on a man named Reyes, who had gone under a vehicle and survived because a tourniquet had been applied correctly, and because the nurse everyone had been laughing at 4 days ago had made the right calls in exactly the right sequence. Claire filed the last chart, capped her pen, and stood up. Her hand still ached where the ceramic had cut it that morning. She wrapped it again with fresh gauze, taped it down, and picked up her next task. What she didn't know yet, what no one in Iron Ridge Military Medical Center knew, was that this day, the casualties, the surgery, every decision she'd made in that trauma bay had been watched. Not by the staff, not by Hargrove, by someone else entirely. And what they'd seen had set something in motion that Claire Donovan was not going to be able to walk away from. And what they'd seen had set something in motion that Claire Donovan was not going to be able to walk away from. The someone watching was a man named Colonel Aldrich Voss. He was 51 years old, gray at the temples, with the particular stillness of someone who had spent decades in rooms where the wrong word at the wrong moment had real consequences. He was not attached to Fort Calloway. He was not attached to Iron Ridge in any official capacity that appeared on the facility's visitor log. What he was attached to, the program, the evaluation, the thing that had no clean name in any document Claire had ever seen, would not become clear to her until it was too late to pretend she hadn't been standing in the middle of it the whole time. Voss had watched the trauma response from the observation corridor on the second floor, the one with the one-way glass that the hospital used for resident training rotations. He had watched without moving for 43 minutes. He had a small notebook in his left hand. He wrote in it exactly twice. Then he took out his phone and made a call. "She's everything the file said," he told whoever answered. "Possibly more." He listened. "No," he said. "Not yet. Let it develop." He closed the phone and stood at the glass a moment longer, watching Claire finish her notes at the nurse's station below. Then he walked back down the corridor and out the side exit into the 17-degree evening, and Iron Ridge had no record that he had ever been there. Monday arrived with a shift change and a reckoning. The reckoning wasn't loud. It rarely was in places like this. It came in the form of a memorandum, 2 pages, official letterhead from the installation commander's office, delivered to the Iron Ridge charge nursing desk at 0730 and addressed to the unit director, Dr. Paulette Stroud. Claire was in the middle of morning handoff when Stroud called her into the office and closed the door. Stroud was 60, direct, and had run the Iron Ridge ER for 9 years without ever developing the habit of softening what she was about to say. She set the memo on the desk between them. "Complaint filed against you," she said. "Yesterday's mass casualty response. Hargrove's unit." Claire looked at the memo. She didn't pick it up. "What's the complaint?" "Unauthorized procedure. The chest decompression on Quan." Stroud said it the way she might say the weather is inconvenient. Flat. "The complaint states you performed an invasive procedure without attending physician authorization. Dr. Fenwick was on record as the attending. I briefed him at the 4-minute mark. He authorized verbally, and I documented it contemporaneously. The complaint states he wasn't present for the procedure. He was scrubbed in with Reyes in OR2. I briefed him by phone. That's in my notes." Stroud looked at her. "I know that, Claire. I've read your notes." She paused. "The complaint wasn't filed by Fenwick." Claire waited. "It was filed by Hargrove, on behalf of his unit." Something cold settled in Claire's chest. Not surprise exactly, but the specific weight of a thing you half expected and still hoped wouldn't come. "He watched you save his man's life," Stroud said, "and then he went back to his billet and filed a formal complaint about the methodology." "When did it come in?" 2,300 last night. 3 hours after he'd apologized for the mug. Claire absorbed that without expression. "The installation's JAG office is reviewing it," Stroud said. "Pending review, you're on modified duty. That means observation and documentation only. No procedures, no primary treatment decisions, until it clears." "How long?" "JAG says 72 hours minimum. Could be a week." Claire looked at the window. Outside, the morning was clear and bitter, the kind of day where the sky was almost offensively blue. "Quan is alive," she said, "because of that procedure." "I know." "If I'd waited for—" "I know, Claire." Stroud's voice was not unkind. "I'm not the one you need to convince, but until this clears, my hands are tied on this." She picked up the memo and held it. "I'm sorry." Claire nodded. She stood. She picked up her badge from the desk. "I'd like to check on the patients from yesterday before I start documentation rounds," she said. Stroud nodded once. "Of course." Quan was awake. He was propped at 30 degrees, chest tube still draining, oxygen monitor clipped to his finger, and he had the specific expression of a man who had been unconscious for a significant portion of the previous day and was now doing the math on what that meant. Claire came in quietly and checked his chart before she said anything. "Numbers look good," she said. He turned to look at her. He had dark circles under his eyes and a bruise forming along his jaw from the vehicle roll, but his color was right and his breathing was even. "You're the one who—" He stopped. "The chest thing. Chest decompression." "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment. "I don't remember any of it." "You wouldn't. They told me I wasn't breathing right. Your lung was partially collapsed. It happens with blunt impact to that side of the chest." He was quiet for a moment. How bad was it? Bad enough that timing mattered, she said simply. But you're here, so the timing was okay. He nodded. He seemed like he wanted to say something more and couldn't find the shape of it. Thank you had probably already been said by somebody on his behalf, and it didn't feel like enough, and he knew it, and she could see him knowing it. Rest, she said. You'll be reassessed this afternoon. Try not to take deep breaths for performance purposes. If it hurts, that's data. He almost smiled. Yes, ma'am. She moved on to the next bay. Reyes was out of surgery and in the ICU on the 3rd floor. She wasn't his primary care nurse, and the modified duty status meant she couldn't function as one anyway, but she stopped at the floor station and read his surgical notes. Both legs. Left femur fractured, right tibia. Significant soft tissue damage. The surgeon, a laconic man named Dr. Carver, who communicated almost entirely in abbreviations, had written prognosis cautiously favorable at the bottom of his post-op summary, which, from Carver, was essentially a standing ovation. She stood at the ICU window for 30 seconds and looked at Reyes through the glass. He was sedated, surrounded by monitors, and looked smaller than he had on the gurney. They all did, afterward. She went back downstairs. The modified duty status put her at the documentation desk, which meant she spent Tuesday and Wednesday doing the work nobody wanted to do. Insurance coding, incident reports, supply chain discrepancies. A backlog of chart corrections that had been accumulating since November. She did it without complaint and without drama, and without telling anyone what it was costing her to sit still while the unit ran without her hands in it. Marcus found out about the complaint on Tuesday afternoon. He came to the documentation desk with the energy of a man who had been sitting on something for several hours and had finally decided to stop. Hargrove filed on you, he said, pulling up a chair. I heard it from Stroud's admin. Yes. After you saved Kwan's life. Among others. Claire. He put his hands flat on the desk. This isn't just friction anymore. This is deliberate. I know what it is. So what are you going to do? She looked at him. My job, within the parameters I've been given. He stared at her. That's it? That's your whole plan? My documentation of Friday's events is thorough, accurate, and time-stamped at every decision point. Fenwick's verbal authorization is in the notes. The patient outcomes speak for themselves. She turned back to the screen. JAG will read the file and clear it, or they won't, and if they don't, I'll address that when it happens. And if Hargrove files again? Or if he finds something else to… Marcus. He stopped. I've been in situations where the people with authority over the room wanted me to fail, she said quietly, without looking up. This is not the worst version of that. He sat with that for a moment. What was the worst version? She didn't answer. He didn't ask again. The escalation came from a direction Claire hadn't fully anticipated. She had expected Hargrove to push. What she hadn't expected was Tuck. Tuck, whose full name was Specialist Aaron Tuckerman, had a particular skill that wasn't listed anywhere in his service record. He was good with people in the social engineering sense. He knew how to have a conversation in a room where the real goal of the conversation wasn't what the words were about. He'd spent the better part of Tuesday working the Iron Ridge staff, not rudely, nothing you could file a complaint about, just talking to people, asking questions, the kind that seemed casual and weren't. By Wednesday evening, 3 things had shifted in ways that were hard to pin to any single conversation. The supply tech who handled the trauma bay inventory had started double-checking Claire's requisition orders before approving them, adding a delay that hadn't existed before. A physician's assistant named Gorton, who had always been neutral toward Claire, had started directing post-op questions to the other nurses when Claire was clearly the appropriate person to ask. And someone, no one could say who exactly, had removed Claire's name from the primary response list for incoming trauma activations, replacing it with a nurse named Willa Stokes, who had 8 months of experience and was not incompetent, but was also not Claire Donovan. None of it was dramatic. None of it would survive scrutiny as a directed campaign. It was just the slow, particular suffocation of someone's professional standing conducted through social pressure and minor administrative adjustments. Marcus saw it by Wednesday night. They're boxing you out, he said. I see it. You have to say something to Stroud. I'm building the file, Claire said. Every delay, every redirection, every deviation from standing protocol, dated and documented. That takes time. Meanwhile, I know what they're doing. Her voice was level, but there was something underneath it now. Not anger, something tighter than that. Let them do it. Marcus looked at her like she'd said something in a language he almost spoke. Why? She closed the file she was working on. Because the more they do, the cleaner the record is when it matters. He shook his head slowly and left. She sat alone at the documentation desk until the night shift change, and then she drove home in the dark through 17 degrees of January silence. And if the stillness in the car was harder to maintain than usual, she gave no evidence of it to anyone, because there was no one there to see. Thursday morning, Pellew came to find her. He looked like he hadn't slept. He stood at the edge of the documentation area with his hands in his jacket pockets and waited until she acknowledged him. You should know something, he said. He dropped his voice. Hargrove got a call Wednesday from someone above his chain. They wanted a full incident report on Sunday's response. Claire kept her expression neutral. That's standard procedure for a mass casualty event. This wasn't standard. It wasn't the JAG office. It was someone else. He shifted his weight. I don't know who. I heard the call by accident. Hargrove sounded... He paused. He sounded like he was being careful, like whoever it was made him careful. Did he say a name? No, he said yes, sir, a lot, and he looked like someone had informed him the ground was moving. Pellew met her eyes. I don't know what that means, but I thought you should know. She held his gaze. Thank you. He nodded once and left quickly, like he half expected someone to have seen him standing there. Claire sat for a moment with what he'd told her. Someone above Hargrove's chain had called. Someone who made a staff sergeant careful. Someone who was asking specifically about Sunday's response. She thought about the observation corridor on the second floor. She'd noticed the light in it Sunday evening while she was finishing her charts. Just briefly, just a shape at the one-way glass before it moved away. She'd noted it and filed it and moved on because there was too much to do to spend time on shapes behind glass. She thought about it now. She opened her documentation file and added a line. One sentence, time-stamped. Then she went back to her work. The JAG clearance came through at 16:40 on Thursday. 2 sentences. The complaint had been reviewed. It was found to be without merit. Claire Donovan was restored to full active duty, effective immediately. Stroud handed her the clearance form in person. Back to primary, she said. Thank you. Don't thank me. Your documentation cleared it, not me. Stroud paused. I want you to know. Fenwick went to the JAG officer directly, confirmed the verbal authorization in person. He didn't have to do that. Claire nodded. I'll thank him. He said you didn't need to. Stroud almost smiled. He also said, and I'm quoting, that the complaint was the most insulting piece of paper he'd received in 30 years of medicine, and that he planned to say so at Hargrove's unit review. Claire walked back to the trauma bay and picked up her stethoscope from the hook where she'd left it on Monday morning. She listened to the room for a moment. The monitors. The ventilator in Bay 3 cycling for a post-op patient. The low background hum of a functional emergency department. The sound of her actual job. She put the stethoscope on and got to work. What she didn't know was that 40 minutes earlier, in the installation commander's conference room on the other side of the base, a meeting had taken place that no one at Iron Ridge had been informed about. Colonel Voss sat at the table. Beside him was a woman in civilian clothes whose name was never spoken aloud in the room. She was referred to only as the director, and everyone at the table behaved accordingly. Across from them was the installation commander, Brigadier General Mercer, who had the look of a man who had been handed information he wasn't sure what to do with and was trying not to show it. The evaluation parameters were met Sunday, Voss said, and then some. The complaint complicated things, Mercer said carefully. The complaint told us something useful, the director said. Her voice was even and unhurried. It told us who Hargrove is under pressure. That's relevant data. Mercer shifted. If Donovan becomes aware that she's been under assessment, she's already aware something is happening, Voss said. She's too good not to be. What she doesn't have is the shape of it. He looked at the director. How long before we move to the next phase? That depends, the director said, on how far Hargrove is willing to go before someone stops him. The room was quiet for a moment. He filed a second complaint this morning, Mercer said, against 3 of the nursing staff, claiming they obstructed his team's access to facility resources. Did they? No. Mercer's jaw tightened. They asked his team not to park a vehicle in the ambulance bay. The director nodded slowly. Then let's see what the next 72 hours produce. Voss stood. He straightened his jacket. She's going to figure out the shape of it before we're ready, he said. I want to be on record that I said that. No one argued with him. Outside the window of the conference room, Iron Ridge Military Medical Center was visible across the installation grounds. In its lit windows, a unit was running at full capacity. Somewhere inside it, a nurse in modified duty turned active was pulling her stethoscope off its hook and getting back to work. Voss looked at the building for just a moment before he turned away. He had the expression of someone watching a clock and knowing it was about to go off. Friday started like any other shift, but by 0800, something was different in the air of the trauma bay, a tension that wasn't clinical, wasn't procedural. Hargrove's team was present in force, which was unusual for a Friday pre-exercise window. They weren't in the waiting area this time. They were in the corridor outside the trauma bay, in full gear, not speaking to each other or to anyone on the nursing staff. Claire clocked it at 08:03 when she came out of the supply room. 6 men in full kit, standing in a hospital corridor at 8 in the morning with no announced training purpose, not moving, not speaking, just present in the specific way that a pressure system is present before a storm breaks. She walked past them to the nurse's station without changing her pace. Hargrove was standing at the end of the corridor. He was looking at her. His face was blank in the way faces go blank when the person wearing it has made a decision and is waiting to execute it. Their eyes met. Claire held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Then she turned, picked up the first chart of the morning, and began her rounds. At 08:17, her hospital-issued phone buzzed. A text from an internal number she didn't recognize. Check the pharmaceutical log. Bay 2. Last 48 hours. She stared at the message for 3 seconds. Then she walked to Bay 2 and pulled the pharmaceutical log from the supply cabinet. She went through it line by line. Halfway down the Wednesday entries, she found it. A morphine pull. 6 milligrams. Logged under her staff ID number. At 14:23 on Wednesday. Claire had been at the documentation desk at 14:23 on Wednesday. She had not been in Bay 2. She had not pulled any medication from any supply in the building that afternoon. Her ID number had been used to log a controlled substance withdrawal that she had not made. She stood very still for a moment. Then she photographed the log with her phone, time-stamped it, and sent a copy to her personal email. She replaced the log exactly where she'd found it. She walked back to the nurse's station and sat down. Her hands were steady. Her pulse was not. Someone had used her credentials to falsify a controlled substance record. That was not a complaint. That was not friction. That was a criminal act, and if it was discovered before she could document the context around it, it was the kind of thing that ended careers and occasionally ended in prosecution. She looked up. Across the corridor, Hargrove was still standing where she'd last seen him. He wasn't looking at her anymore. He was looking at his phone. But Tuck was looking at her. And Tuck, for the first time since she'd met him, was not smiling. And Tuck, for the first time since she'd met him, was not smiling. Claire did not move immediately. That was the first discipline. Not the action, but the pause before it. She had learned that in a different life, in environments where the instinct to react fast was exactly what got people killed. She sat at the nurse's station and breathed and let her mind run the problem the way it needed to run it, without the noise of panic getting in the way. Someone had accessed her staff credentials and used them to log a controlled substance pull she hadn't made. The log showed 6 milligrams of morphine on Wednesday afternoon. She had a photograph of that entry, time-stamped, already in her personal email. What she needed now was a corroborating record, something that placed her at the documentation desk at 14:23 on Wednesday, with enough specificity that the alibi was structural, not just her word against a log entry. She opened the documentation system and pulled her Wednesday activity record. The system tracked every chart access, every entry, every timestamp. At 14:18 on Wednesday, she had opened a post-op chart. At 14:21, she had entered a correction. At 14:27, she had opened a second chart. There was a continuous thread of documented computer activity from 14:10 through 14:45 that made it physically impossible for her to have been standing at a supply cabinet in Bay 2 at 14:23. She printed it. She photographed the printout. She sent it. Then she stood up, walked to the unit director's office, and knocked. Stroud looked up from her desk. "I need 3 minutes," Claire said. She got them. She laid out what she'd found in the pharmaceutical log without embellishment, without accusation, without naming Hargrove or Tuck or anyone specific. She presented it as a discrepancy that required administrative review. Her credentials, a pull she didn't make, a timestamp she could disprove with system records. She placed the printed activity log on Stroud's desk. Stroud looked at the documents without touching them for a long moment. "You didn't come to me with this," she said finally. "You came to me with documentation." "Yes." Stroud exhaled through her nose. "That's either very disciplined or very frightening, and I'm not sure which." She looked up. "I'm going to have to involve the pharmacy director and the security office." "I know." "This is going to make noise, Claire." "I know that too." Stroud looked at her. "Are you all right?" It was the first time anyone had asked her that since Sunday. Claire registered it, tucked it somewhere she'd deal with later, and said, "I'm functional, which is what matters right now." Stroud picked up her phone. "Go do your rounds. Let me make some calls." The next 4 hours were the specific kind of difficult that didn't show on the outside. Claire moved through her shift with the precision she always moved with: patient assessments, medication verification, 2 admission workups, a wound check on a post-op contractor who was healing better than expected and wanted to talk about it at length. She listened, she charted, she moved. She did not look at the corridor where Hargrove's team had been standing, partly because looking would signal something and partly because they were gone by 900 and she didn't know where, which was its own problem. By 1100, the pharmacy director, a careful man named Osei, had pulled the Bay 2 controlled substance log for a full week audit. The security office had started pulling badge reader data for the Bay 2 entrance. Neither of them told Claire this directly. She inferred it from the specific quality of the silence that had developed around Stroud's office, and from the fact that Osei had walked through the trauma bay at 10:47 without making eye contact with anyone, which was not his normal behavior. Marcus found her during a supply restock at 11:30. "Security was asking about the Bay 2 camera," he said quietly, restocking beside her so the conversation looked like work. "Apparently the feed has a 4-hour gap Wednesday afternoon." Claire went still. A gap? System error, they're calling it, but Rennie in security says the last time there was a system error on that camera was 18 months ago during a maintenance cycle. He paused. This wasn't a maintenance cycle. She processed that without showing it. The camera gap meant the falsified log entry had been planned. Whoever used her credentials had known or arranged for the visual record to be absent. That was not opportunistic. That was deliberate, coordinated, and it had required access to both the pharmaceutical supply system and the building's camera management. "How many people have access to the camera system?" she asked. "Facilities management, security supervisors, and anyone with installation-level clearance who knows the right request pathway." Marcus looked at her sideways. "Claire, this is bigger than a complaint." "I know what it is." "Then you know you need someone in your corner who isn't just me and Stroud." She finished the restock and closed the cabinet. "I'm handling it." He grabbed her arm. Not hard, but enough. "Listen to me. I've seen things like this go wrong. Not here, before. I've seen it go wrong because the person being targeted thought the system would catch it if they just kept doing everything right." His voice dropped. "The system doesn't always catch it in time." She looked at his hand on her arm. He let go. "I hear you," she said. "I do." She met his eyes. "But if I reach for outside help before the internal record is complete, I look reactive. I look like someone who panicked. The documentation has to exist first. Then the help means something." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, tight. She went back to her rounds. The escalation she hadn't planned for came at 13:47, the same time the training accident call had come in on Sunday, which she noticed and filed away as meaningless coincidence because she was not superstitious, and the alternative was spending energy she didn't have. Hargrove came into the ER alone. No team, no gear. Just Hargrove in his duty uniform, walking through the main entrance with the deliberate pace of someone who had rehearsed what they were about to do and was now executing it. He went to the nurses' station. Claire was on the other side of the trauma bay and watched him through the glass partition. He spoke to the desk nurse, a quiet woman named Patel, who listened and then pointed in Claire's direction. Hargrove looked across the bay. Claire walked toward him. She didn't rush it. They met in the middle of the open trauma bay floor, which meant everyone in the unit could see the conversation, which she suspected was not accidental on his part. "I need to talk to you," he said. "We're talking." He glanced around. "Privately." "This is a hospital, Staff Sergeant. There's no private." She held his gaze. "Whatever you need to say, you can say here." Something moved in his face, a calculation. He'd prepared for a private conversation, and now he was adjusting in real time, and the adjustment cost him a beat. "I want to withdraw the complaint," he said. Claire didn't react. "The one I filed Monday, I want it withdrawn." "You'd need to contact the JAG office directly," she said. "It's already been adjudicated." "I know, but I wanted you to hear it from me." He held her gaze. "It was a bad call. I acted on—" He stopped, restarted. "I was wrong." The bay was very quiet. Not silent. Monitors, ventilators, the low hum of the building. But the human noise in it had dropped in the specific way it does when everyone in a room is listening without appearing to listen. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. "Because it was wrong when I did it, and it's still wrong." "Hargrove." Her voice was even. "What happened to the camera in Bay 2 on Wednesday afternoon?" The shift in his face was small, but she was watching for it, and it was there. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. "The security camera. 4-hour gap. Same afternoon someone used my credentials to pull a controlled substance I didn't pull." She kept her voice exactly the same register it had been. Conversational. Clear. "Does that ring any bells?" A long pause. "No," he said. She studied him for 3 seconds. He held the look, but there was something behind his eyes that hadn't been there during any of their previous exchanges. Not guilt, exactly. Something more complicated than guilt. Something that looked, if she was reading it right, like a man who had just realized the situation had grown past the point where he controlled it. "All right," she said. "Was there anything else?" He left. She stood in the middle of the trauma bay floor for a moment. Then she went back to work. At 1600, 3 things happened within 30 minutes of each other. The first, Stroud called Claire back into her office and told her that the pharmacy audit had confirmed the falsified entry. The morphine pool logged under Claire's ID had no corresponding patient order, no administration record, and no witness. The badge reader data showed Claire's ID badge had not been used to enter Bay 2 at any point on Wednesday afternoon. "The security office is treating it as potential credential fraud," Stroud said carefully, which was the professional way of saying someone had committed a crime. The second, Pellew texted her from a personal number she didn't have saved. "Tuck is gone. Checked out of the billet this morning. Nobody's saying where." She read the text twice. Tuck. The one who had engineered the social pressure campaign. The one who had not been smiling Friday morning when she came out of Bay 2. Gone. Which meant either he'd been pulled out or he'd removed himself, and neither option felt accidental. The third, at 1628, an unfamiliar vehicle pulled into the Iron Ridge parking lot. A black government plate SUV, which was not unusual near a military installation. What was unusual was the second vehicle behind it. And the third. Claire saw them through the trauma bay window while she was reviewing afternoon charts. 3 vehicles, government plates, moving with the specific coordination of people who had decided where they were going before they arrived. She watched them park. 4 people got out of the first vehicle, military but not in standard uniform. The specific civilian-adjacent dress of people operating at a level where standard uniforms were optional. Two more from the second vehicle, and from the third, moving with the unhurried authority of someone who had never once in his life needed to hurry to assert his presence, Colonel Aldrich Voss. She recognized him. Not from Iron Ridge, not from anything recent, from a briefing room in a building that didn't have a public address, 7 years ago, when she had been someone entirely different. He had been in the third row. She had been presenting targeting parameters to a room full of people who were not supposed to exist in the capacity they existed in. He had asked one question at the end. She remembered the question. She remembered his face asking it. She stood at the window with a chart in her hand, and she felt the shape of the last 2 weeks rearrange itself around this single data point. The observation window on the second floor, the call that made Hargrove careful. The evaluation parameters Voss had referenced in a room she hadn't been in, but whose existence she had just deduced from the pattern of everything that had happened since the operators arrived. This wasn't a harassment campaign that had gotten out of hand. This was something else entirely. Voss and his team walked into the hospital's main entrance, and Claire turned from the window and picked up the next chart in her stack, because standing at a window watching was not the same as being ready. And she had learned a long time ago that ready was the only position worth being in. They found her at 17:15. She was in Bay 3 with a patient, a routine case, minor laceration on a training contractor's forearm, when Stroud appeared at the curtain with the specific expression of someone delivering news they don't fully understand yet. "There are some people who'd like to speak with you," Stroud said. "Conference room B, when you're done here." 5 minutes, Claire said, without looking up from the suture. The contractor, a stocky man in his 40s who had been trying to make conversation since she started, looked at her. "You in some kind of trouble?" "Hold still," she said, and placed the last suture. She dressed the wound, documented the procedure, and walked to conference room B. Voss was at the head of the table. 2 of his team flanked him. Beside them sat Brigadier General Mercer, the installation commander, who had the look of a man attending a meeting where he understood his role was to be present and not much else. The woman introduced as the director sat to Voss's left, in civilian clothes, with the particular stillness of someone accustomed to being the most important person in rooms that didn't acknowledge it. Claire sat across from them without being asked. "Nurse Donovan," Voss said. "Colonel Voss," she said. The room went quiet in a specific way. Voss looked at her for a long moment. "You know me." "Briefing room, 7 years ago. You asked about lateral wind variables at extended range. You were concerned the data was being modeled at sea level, and the operational environment wasn't sea level." Another silence. "You were right, by the way," she added. "The model was adjusted." Mercer looked between them like a man watching a conversation in a language he thought he spoke. Voss leaned back slightly. "Then you already know this isn't about the pharmaceutical log." "The pharmaceutical log is a separate issue," she said. "That's a criminal matter, and it'll be addressed as one regardless of what this meeting is." "Agreed." He folded his hands. "I want to be direct with you." "Please." "The operators assigned to this installation were not here solely for a training cycle." He paused. "They were here as part of a structured evaluation. The evaluation had 2 subjects, the unit and you." She didn't let anything show on her face. "How long?" "The assessment parameters were established before you were assigned to Iron Ridge." "That's not what I asked." He met her eyes. 14 months. 14 months. Her entire time at Iron Ridge. Every shift, every decision, every patient she had fought for in that trauma bay. The entire thing had been a container built around her. "The unit's behavior," the director said, speaking for the first time. Her voice was measured and without effect. "The harassment, the complaint, the credential incident. We want to be clear that the credential incident was not sanctioned. That was Tuckerman acting outside his parameters, and he has been removed from the evaluation and is now subject to a separate investigation." "Good," Claire said. "The rest of it," Voss said, "was designed to create pressure, to see how you performed under institutional attack, not just clinical pressure, which you've demonstrated you can handle, but the specific kind of pressure that comes from having your professional standing threatened by people with authority over your environment." The room was very quiet. "And," Claire said, "and you exceeded every benchmark we set." He reached into the folder in front of him and slid a document across the table. She didn't pick it up. "What we need to discuss now is what comes next." She looked at the document without touching it. Standard government formatting, classification markings at the top that she recognized, her name in the subject line. "What is this?" she asked, even though she could read the header from where she was sitting. "An appointment," Voss said. "Lead battlefield trauma instructor, Joint Special Operations Medical Command, with continued assignment here at Iron Ridge as your operational base." "Effective when?" "That depends on what you decide." She sat back. She looked at the document. She thought about Kwan's oxygen saturation reversing on the monitor, about Reyes in the OR, about Bird's unequal pupils and the 2 days she'd fought Hargrove for, about a pharmaceutical log with her name on a line she'd never signed. She thought about a photograph in her locker with brown paper taped over it. "The operators," she said. "The ones from the unit. What happens to them?" Voss exchanged a glance with the director. "That," he said carefully, "is currently under review." "That's not an answer." "Donovan, what happens to them?" she said again. Not louder, just with the specific quality of someone who was not going to move until the question was answered. The director spoke. "Disciplinary review, potential suspension of deployment status, mandatory retraining requirements." She paused. "The extent of those consequences is partly contingent on the full investigation findings, including the credential fraud. Tuckerman's involvement, yes. And Hargrove." Claire looked at Voss. He knew the complaint was going to land on a woman who'd just saved 4 of his men. He filed it anyway. Voss held her gaze. "Yes. Then that needs to be in the record." "It will be." She looked at the document on the table. Then she picked it up. She read it fully, every paragraph, every clause. She took 4 minutes and no one at the table made a sound. When she set it back down, she looked at Voss directly. "I have conditions," she said. He almost, not quite, but almost, smiled. "I assumed you would." She opened her mouth to begin. The door opened. A young aide appeared in the gap, slightly breathless, looking at Mercer. "Sir, we have an incident. Training Compound 3. The report is—" He glanced at Claire, then back at Mercer. "Sir, they're asking for medical command on site. Multiple casualties. They're saying it's bad." Everyone at the table moved. Claire was already standing before Voss had pushed his chair back, the appointment document still on the table in front of her empty seat, her stethoscope already in her hand, moving toward the door with the flat, focused pace of someone who had never actually stopped being exactly who she was. She was already standing before Voss had pushed his chair back, the appointment document still on the table in front of her empty seat, her stethoscope already in her hand, moving toward the door with the flat, focused pace of someone who had never actually stopped being exactly who she was. The aide held the door. Claire went through it first. The corridor outside Conference Room B connected to the main administrative wing, and from there it was 60 meters to the ER entrance. She covered it in under 40 seconds, not running. Running in a hospital meant panic moved with you, and panic was a contaminant. But moving with the specific economy of someone who had made decisions about how to use a body under pressure, and these were those decisions in practice. She hit the ER and went straight to the charge desk. "What's the count?" she said to Patel. Patel was already on the phone and held up 4 fingers without breaking the call. Then a 5th, 5 casualties. Training Compound 3. Claire had driven past Compound 3 twice in her 11 months at Iron Ridge, a live fire facility with a vehicle obstacle course and a structure clearance range, surrounded by blast barriers and a perimeter fence that made it look from the road like an industrial yard that didn't want visitors. She pulled the trauma bay into readiness without being asked because she was already running the numbers. 5 casualties from a training compound meant a spectrum, minor to severe, unknown distribution, unknown mechanism, which was the part that mattered most because mechanism told you what you were walking into before the doors opened. Marcus appeared at her elbow. "What do we know?" "Nothing yet. Get Fenwick down here." "He's in clinic." "Get him." Marcus went. Voss came through the ER entrance at a measured walk, 2 of his team behind him. He came to stand beside Claire at the trauma bay entrance and didn't speak, which she appreciated because there was nothing useful he could add to the next 4 minutes, and he seemed to understand that. Mercer appeared a moment later, slightly winded. He looked at Voss. "Compound 3, he said. "The unit running scenarios out there. It's Hargrove's remaining team." Claire looked up from the cart she was arranging. "Hargrove's team," she said flatly. "They were running a structure clearance evolution. Something went wrong with the breach sequence." Mercer's voice had the careful quality of a man choosing words in front of people he wasn't sure how to categorize. "There was a secondary detonation. Unplanned." The room absorbed that. An unplanned secondary detonation in a structure clearance exercise meant the possibilities arranged themselves in a specific and ugly order. Blast injuries, penetrating trauma from fragmentation, concussive damage, possible burns, potential crush injury if any structural elements had failed. 5 casualties from that scenario could mean anything from ruptured eardrums to something she didn't want to think about until she was looking at it. "ETA," she said. 6 minutes, the aide said from the doorway. 6 minutes. She turned back to the cart. Behind her, Voss said something quietly to Mercer that she didn't catch and didn't try to. Whatever it was, it could wait. The next 6 minutes could not. Bochet. They came in fast and badly. The first gurney through the door carried a soldier with blast injury to both hands and a face that had been close enough to the secondary to catch fragmentation. Small pieces, superficial on the left side. But the right eye was a problem she catalogued immediately and flagged for ophthalmology before she'd finished the first sentence of her assessment. "Bay 1, she said. "Eye kit on the cart. Don't let him rub his face." The second was a respiratory case, a man named Ortega who Claire recognized as one of Hargrove's team, late 20s, who had been standing near the breach point when the secondary went. His lungs were doing something that announced itself before she touched him. The crackling she heard through her stethoscope in the first 10 seconds told her she had a pulmonary contusion developing, which was the category of injury that looked manageable and could stop being manageable with very little warning. Bay 2. O2 on. High flow. Chest X-ray now. Not in a minute. Now. The third and fourth came together, both ambulatory, but walking with the specific, careful movement of people in pain who hadn't yet inventoried the full extent of it. Burns on the forearms of the third. Partial thickness, left arm worse than right, consistent with being near an ignition source when it went. The fourth was holding his own left knee at an angle that told her the joint had been wrenched badly. Possibly a ligament failure, possibly fracture. Neither of them was critical. Bay 4, she told the Burns case. Bay 5, you sit and don't put weight on that until someone tells you to. The fifth gurney came in at a different speed than the others. It came in fast, which was the thing that made the room shift. The two soldiers pushing it were both pushing hard, leaning into it, and the medic running alongside had manual pressure applied with both hands to the patient's left side and was not saying anything, which was its own kind of information. Claire moved to it before it stopped moving. The patient was Hargrove. She registered it without any expression and began her assessment in the same second she registered it, because the two things, who he was and what his body was doing, were entirely separate categories, and she had long ago learned to keep them that way. His color was wrong. Gray undertone to the skin that spoke of blood going somewhere it shouldn't. The medic's hands were on his left flank, and the field dressing under those hands was dark and wet. His breathing was rapid and shallow, and he was conscious. His eyes were open, tracking her face as she leaned over him. But the consciousness had that particular dimness that meant it was working hard to stay. "Talk to me," she said to the medic. "Left flank penetrating fragment. Went in at an angle, we don't know where it stopped. BP was 90/60 in the field, dropped to 84 in the vehicle. Hypotensive. Penetrating trauma. Unknown depth and trajectory." "Bay 3, she said. "Oneg running before we park him. Move." They moved, she worked. Hargrove's hand caught her wrist as she reached across him to adjust the dressing. Not hard. He didn't have the strength for hard, but deliberate. She stopped and looked at his face. "I didn't know about the log," he said. His voice was rough and thin. "Tuck, I didn't authorize that." She held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds. "I know," she said. Then she removed his hand from her wrist and went back to work. She wasn't certain that was true, but she was certain it wasn't the conversation to have with a man whose blood pressure was dropping and whose abdomen was full of something that wasn't supposed to be there, and certainty could be revisited when he was stable enough to revisit it. The next 32 minutes were the kind that compressed time in both directions. She ran the bay with Fenwick beside her, called the imaging sequence, managed the O-neg transfusion, and made the call to get Hargrove to the OR at the 16-minute mark when the ultrasound showed free fluid in the abdominal cavity in a volume and pattern that meant surgery was not optional and was not something to approach gradually. Carver was already scrubbed. She had called him at minute 9. They took Hargrove up at 18:03. Claire stood at the base of the trauma bay for a moment after the gurney went through the elevator doors. She was aware of Voss watching her from the corridor. She was aware of the rest of the bay. 4 other casualties in various states of treatment, Fenwick moving between them, Marcus running the IV on the Burns case, Patel on the phone with the ophthalmologist about the fragmentation in Bay 1. She was aware of all of it, and she needed 30 seconds that didn't belong to any of it. She walked to the supply room, which was empty, and stood there for 30 seconds with her back against the closed door and both hands pressed flat against the cool metal shelving behind her. Her hands were shaking, slightly, enough to know. She pressed them harder against the shelf until they stopped. Then she went back out. Sam. By 2000 hours, the immediate crisis had resolved into something that could be monitored rather than fought. The fragmentation case in Bay 1 was going to lose vision in his right eye. The ophthalmologist had come down, assessed, and used the word inoperable in a tone that left no room for negotiation. The soldier, his name was Garrett, had received that information in the bay with Claire standing beside him, and the thing she remembered about the next 10 minutes was that he didn't make a sound. He just looked at the ceiling for a long time. She stayed until he looked at her, and then she said the only thing she could that wasn't useless. "You're going to have to rebuild a lot. You know how to do that." He had nodded slowly, and she had moved on because there were 4 other people in the bay who needed things from her, and she couldn't give him back what he'd lost by staying. Ortega's pulmonary contusion had not progressed to the worst case. The chest X-ray showed it contained, and 4 hours of supplemental oxygen and careful monitoring had his saturation numbers holding. He was not out of the woods. Contusions had a habit of revealing their full extent at the 36-hour mark. But he was stable, and the trajectory was cautiously in the right direction. The Burns case would need a specialist consult, but the injuries were manageable. The knee was a ligament tear, not a fracture, which was the better of the 2 options, but still meant months of recovery. Hargrove was in surgery. Carver sent a nurse down at 2015 with a note that said 3 hours minimum, fragment near portal structures, proceeding carefully, which translated for anyone who spoke Carver to, "This is serious and I'm not rushing it." Claire sat at the documentation desk and wrote the shift notes. Every patient, every decision, every timestamp. She wrote them the way she always wrote them, complete, accurate, without editorializing. And when she was done, she sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment and let the exhaustion exist without acting on it. Voss appeared at the desk at 20:30. He sat down across from her without asking, which she found she didn't object to. "The investigation has been formally opened," he said. "Tuckerman's actions are being handled as a federal matter. The credential fraud, the camera interference, both. Good. Hargrove's complaint and its context will be part of the same review." He paused. "His cooperation will be relevant to how that resolves." "He told me he didn't know about the log," she said. "In the bay, before we took him up. Do you believe him?" She thought about it honestly. "I think he drew the line somewhere and Tuck went past it. Whether that's innocence or just a different category of culpability, that's for the investigation to sort out." Voss looked at her. "You saved his life tonight." "I did my job tonight." "You did your job for a man who filed a complaint against you and whose team spent 2 weeks trying to dismantle your professional standing." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "That's not a small thing." "It's not a complicated thing either," she said. "He needed medical attention. I provided it. The rest is a separate file." Voss leaned forward slightly. "The appointment still stands. The conditions you were about to name before the call came in, I'd like to hear them." She looked at him. Tomorrow. Fair enough? He stood. At the edge of the desk, he stopped. Call sign Valkyrie 6, he said. Not a question. Just the words, said quietly. She didn't react. The record attached to that designation, he continued, is one of the most thoroughly classified documents I've accessed in 22 years of service. What I can tell you is that what I watched you do in that bay on Sunday and tonight is entirely consistent with everything in it. She said nothing. He nodded once and walked away. She sat for a moment with that. Then she went to check on Ortega. The formal review convened at 900 the following Monday in the installation's main conference facility, a room large enough to seat 30, which it did, because by that point the investigation had expanded in scope and the number of people with a stake in its findings had grown accordingly. Claire was not the subject of the review. She was a witness, which was a distinction that mattered considerably and one that had been made explicit in the written notification she'd received Friday morning. She sat at the table in her duty uniform with a folder of documentation in front of her that she had assembled over the preceding 72 hours with the same precision she brought to a trauma assessment. Thorough, sequential, nothing assumed, everything sourced. The review board consisted of 3 officers, a JAG representative, a civilian investigator from the credential fraud case, and the director, who sat at the end of the table in the same civilian clothes she'd worn to the conference room B meeting and radiated the same quality of quiet authority she'd had then. Hargrove was not present. He was in post-surgical recovery, stable, and had provided a written statement from his hospital bed. The statement had been delivered to Voss by Carver's ward nurse at 700, sealed, and was now in the JAG representative's folder. Tuck was not present for different reasons. Pellew was present. He sat 2 chairs down from Claire at the witness side of the table, in dress uniform, with the expression of someone who had made a difficult decision and was now living in the aftermath of it and finding it harder than expected. The review opened at 0904. The JAG officer, a precise woman named Major Hollins, began with the credential fraud. She laid out the evidence in sequence: the falsified pharmaceutical log, the badge reader data, the camera gap, the digital forensics on the system access, and the picture that assembled itself from those pieces was not ambiguous. Someone with knowledge of the hospital's camera management system and access to the pharmaceutical supply credentials had engineered a paper trail designed to implicate Claire in a controlled substance violation. The forensic analysis of the system access had traced the credential use to a terminal in the installation's administrative network. That terminal had been accessed using a login that belonged to a facilities management contractor who had not been on site the afternoon in question. His credentials had been used remotely, which meant whoever had done it had also breached the contractor's access. Specialist Tuckerman's digital devices seized Wednesday evening contained cached access to both the hospital's supply system and the installation camera management portal, Hollins said. The connection is direct and documented. The room was quiet. Tuckerman has been charged, Hollins continued. He is currently in federal custody pending arraignment. He is not a subject of this review. He is a separate criminal matter. What this review addresses is the command environment that produced the conditions in which this occurred. Claire watched the 3 officers on the board. 2 of them had the expressions of people processing something uncomfortable. The third, a colonel named Watt, who had barely moved since the meeting began, was writing steadily in a notebook and showed no expression at all. The second section of the review addressed the harassment pattern. Hollins walked through it with the same methodical clarity. Each logged incident, each documented deviation from protocol, each report of staff being talked over or redirected or blocked from their own professional function. She cited dates, she cited the unit log entries, she cited Stroud's administrative records. She cited the complaint Hargrove had filed on Monday. The complaint was adjudicated as without merit by the JAG office, she said. What the review is examining is the context and motivation behind its filing. A formal complaint against a nurse who had, within the preceding 18 hours, performed emergency chest decompression, managed a 4-casualty mass trauma response, and coordinated a surgical handoff that the operating surgeon has described in his post-operative report as, she found the page, textbook in preparation and instrumental in outcome. She set the page down. Staff Sergeant Hargrove's written statement, received this morning, Acknowledges that the complaint was filed in retaliation for the modified duty restriction placed on Specialist Bird. She paused. He acknowledges this directly and without qualification. Mercer, sitting along the wall with two aides, shifted in his chair. The third section was Pellew. He had submitted a voluntary witness statement earlier in the week and had requested to speak in person, which the board had granted. He was 22 years old, and he sat at the table with his hands flat in front of him, and he did not look comfortable, but he held his posture and his voice was even. He described what he had witnessed: the corridor incident, the pattern of behavior from Hargrove and Tuck toward the nursing staff, the phone call he'd overheard, Hargrove speaking with someone above his chain in a way that indicated pressure was being applied from an external source, and then something he hadn't put in his written statement. "I want to add something," he said, looking at the board. "For the record." Hollins nodded. "Go ahead." Staff Sergeant Hargrove, whatever he did wrong in this, he's not a bad soldier. He's a very good one. Pellew was careful with it, choosing each word. But there was a dynamic in this unit where the way we treated people outside our team was... He stopped. "We were told, implicitly, that the medical staff here were support assets, not colleagues, not people with authority in their own right." He paused. "I don't think anyone said that out loud. I just think it was the air we breathed in that unit, and none of us pushed back on it." He looked at Claire. Then he looked back at the board. "I should have pushed back," he said. "Earlier." The room was very quiet. Hollins made a note. "Thank you, Specialist," he said. Claire was asked to speak at 1043. She opened her folder and she did not perform it. She did not emphasize, did not editorialize, did not speak with anything in her voice except the flat sequential accuracy of someone presenting a clinical record. She walked through each incident from her own perspective, corroborated everything with the documentation she'd brought, and answered questions from the board with the same quality of precision. Watt, the colonel who had been writing steadily throughout the morning, spoke for the first time during her testimony. "Nurse Donovan," he said, "you were made aware late Friday of the full scope of the evaluation framework, the assessment that had been running since your assignment here began." "Yes, sir." "And you continued to perform your duties through the weekend, including tonight's mass casualty response, without that knowledge affecting your conduct." "The knowledge didn't change what the patients needed," she said. He looked at her over the top of his notebook. "No," he said. "I don't imagine it did." He went back to writing. The review concluded at 12:15. The board did not deliberate in the room. Hollins collected the documents. The director collected herself from the end of the table with the unhurried movement of someone with a flight to catch, and the room dispersed into the corridor in clusters of conversation that Claire stayed outside of. Voss found her in the corridor. "Conditions," he said simply. She had thought about them over the weekend. She had written them down, crossed out 2, revised a 3rd. She handed him the single page. He read it. The first condition, the nursing staff at Iron Ridge who had been affected by the harassment pattern. Patel, the 3 nurses Tuck's second complaint had targeted, 2 others who had documented incidents, were to receive formal recognition from the installation command. Not a form letter. Something with weight. The second, Bird, whose concussion she had caught and who had been cooperative throughout, was to have no adverse notation in his service record related to the medical grounding. He had done nothing wrong. He shouldn't carry anything that said otherwise. The third, Pellew was to be considered for a commendation for voluntary testimony. Doing the right thing at cost to yourself was worth recognizing. The fourth was the one she'd rewritten 3 times. My operational history remains classified at its current level. No public disclosure, no ceremony, no announcement beyond what is required for the appointment itself. Voss read the 4th condition twice. "You don't want the recognition," he said. "I want accountability," she said. "Those aren't the same thing." He folded the page and put it in his jacket pocket. "I'll see what I can do." "I'm not asking for what you can do," she said. "I'm telling you what the conditions are." He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded. "All right." Hargrove's post-surgical recovery was on the 3rd floor, in the same wing as the ICU where Reyes had spent his first days after the vehicle accident. Claire went up at 16:30, after the afternoon chart review was done and the evening shift had started. She went alone, without announcement, without a clinical purpose that would have given her a cover for being there. He was awake, pale, reduced by the anesthesia in the preceding days, propped at 30 degrees with the specific, careful stillness of someone who has been told not to move a certain way and is now acutely aware of that direction. There was a drain coming out of his left side, and his face had the hollowed quality that comes after surgery takes something out of you, and you haven't yet started the process of getting it back. He looked at her when she came in and didn't say anything. She sat in the chair beside the bed. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Carver says the fragment missed the portal vein by about 4 millimeters, Hargrove said finally. I read the report. 4 millimeters. He looked at the ceiling. That's... Yes, she said. Another silence. I meant what I said in the bay, he said, about Tuck. I didn't know he went that far. I believe you, she said. Whether that changes anything about your own responsibility. That's not my call. He turned his head to look at her. His face was hard to read through the fatigue and the medication, but there was something in it that hadn't been there in any of their earlier exchanges, an absence of the performance. The armor was down because it was too heavy to hold up right now, and what was underneath it was just a person who had made significant mistakes and was lying in a hospital bed thinking about them. I filed that complaint because I didn't know what to do with the fact that you were better at your job than I'd given you credit for, he said. That's what it was. It wasn't strategic. It was... He stopped. It was stupid, and it was wrong. Claire looked at him. Yes, she said, it was. He nodded, like he'd needed to hear her say it plainly rather than let him soften it. What happens now? He said. The board makes its findings. The findings drive the consequences. You cooperated. That statement you gave Hollins is in the record. Will it matter? It should. She paused. Whether it does is above both our pay grades. He almost exhaled something that was close to a laugh. It cost him, and he stopped it quickly. She stood up. Get your rest, she said. You've got a long recovery and then retraining, and you should go into both of them rested. He looked at her. Retraining. You didn't hear that from me yet. She left before he could respond. Otat. The board's findings came down at 800 on Wednesday, 48 hours after the review convened. Claire was at the nurse's station when Stroud brought her a copy. She read it standing up, which was how she read most things. Tuckerman. Federal charges filed, military career terminated. Credential fraud, unauthorized access to classified systems, conduct unbecoming. The list ran to 7 counts, and none of them were the kind that resolved cleanly. Hargrove. Formal reprimand entered into permanent service record. Deployment suspension for 90 days pending psychological evaluation and retraining completion. His cooperation and written acknowledgement of wrongdoing had been weighed as mitigating factors. The complaint he'd filed had been formally designated as retaliatory and would remain in his record as such. The remaining members of the unit, mandatory retraining cycle, duty status review, formal written reprimand for each incident logged in the unit report. Their deployment was suspended until the retraining was complete. The nursing staff who had been targeted by the second complaint, formal letter of recognition from the installation command, signed by Mercer, acknowledging that the complaint had been determined to be without factual basis and that their professional conduct throughout the relevant period had been exemplary. Claire read that paragraph twice. Bird, no adverse notation. Pellew, commendation recommended, forwarded to his service record with a notation of voluntary testimony in service of an accurate official record. She set the document down. Marcus was watching her from across the station. Well, he said. She slid the document across the desk toward him. He read it. His expression moved through several things in a short period of time. He stopped. That's actually... Yes, she said. And you? She looked up from the chart she'd already picked back up. What about me? The appointment, whatever Voss brought you. She turned the page on the chart. That's being processed. Claire? She looked at him. Are you okay? He said. Same question Stroud had asked her, but from Marcus it carried different weight. 11 months of working alongside her, covering her blind spots, watching her carry things she never put down in front of anyone. She thought about the supply room, the 30 seconds with her back against the shelf, the shaking in her hands that she'd pressed out before anyone could see it. "I'm getting there," she said. It was the most honest thing she'd said to anyone in weeks. He nodded. He seemed to understand that it wasn't an invitation for more, and he respected that, which was one of the reasons she trusted him. She went back to the chart. Okay. What came 3 days later she had not fully anticipated. Not the form of it, even though she had anticipated that something was coming. It came in the shape of Hargrove's team, assembled in the Iron Ridge main briefing room on a Friday afternoon, in their service uniforms, all 5 of the remaining unit members. Hargrove was there too, still moving carefully. Drain removed 2 days prior, cleared for limited mobility by Carver, with a list of things he was not allowed to do that ran to a page and a half. Voss had arranged it. He told her it was going to happen and she'd said she didn't need it, and he'd said that was precisely why it needed to happen. She stood at the front of the room. They stood facing her, at attention, which was not something she had required and which they had apparently decided to do themselves, which told her something. Hargrove spoke first. He spoke carefully, not from a script, which she could tell because the words were slightly imperfect in the way that real speech is when someone is choosing it honestly. "We judged what we could see," he said. "We didn't look further than that. And what we could see told us you were less than you are. That was a failure of observation and a failure of," he paused, "respect, which is not a small failure in this work." He looked at her directly. "I'm sorry," he said. "That's the whole thing. I'm sorry." The room was very quiet. Ortega spoke next. Then Garrett, whose right eye was bandaged and who would not be looking at anything with it ever again, spoke last among the team, and what he said was short. "You made the right calls on Sunday. I'm trying to do the same." Claire stood at the front of the room and let them finish. When they were done, she didn't give them absolution, and she didn't perform forgiveness, and she didn't offer a speech about moving forward. She said what was true. Accountability is the beginning of something, not the end of it. What you do in retraining and after is the part that matters. She looked at each of them in turn. "I expect you to be better," she said, "not for my sake, because better is what this work requires." Hargrove nodded. Then, slowly, he straightened to attention. One by one, the rest of them followed. It was not a grand gesture. It was a small room in a concrete building in January in Montana, and 5 men coming to attention was a minor physical event in the world. But Claire held it for a moment without looking away. Then she dismissed them. She walked out of the briefing room and down the corridor toward the ER, and as she turned the corner, she nearly walked into Voss, who was standing in the hallway with his hands in his jacket pockets. "The appointment paperwork cleared this morning," he said. "Official as of Monday." She kept walking. He fell into step beside her. "There's one more thing," he said. Something in his tone made her slow. "The evaluation," he said. "The 14-month assessment. The framework, the parameters, the reason for all of it." He paused. "You've been assuming it was a standard special operations medical assessment." She stopped walking. She turned to look at him. His expression was the same as it always was, measured, without performance. But there was something underneath it that hadn't been there before. The look of someone about to place a significant card on the table. "There's a program," he said, "classified at a level that means I can't tell you the name of it in this corridor. What I can tell you is that it doesn't exist in any document you've seen, and what it needs..." He paused. "What it has needed for 3 years is someone with a specific combination of qualifications that is genuinely rare." She held his gaze. "Battlefield trauma capability at the highest operational level," he said. "Sniper qualified, combat instructor history, and the specific kind of judgment that doesn't break under institutional pressure." He let that sit for a moment. "You're the first person in 3 years to score in the operational range on all 4. The corridor was empty. The monitors from the trauma bay hummed faintly through the wall. "The appointment," she said slowly. "Lead trauma instructor. That's not the actual offer." "It's part of it," he said. "The cover component." She stared at him. "The program activates in 6 weeks," he said. There's an operational requirement that has been pending a qualified medical lead for a significant period of time. He stopped. I need your answer before Monday. She looked at him for a long moment, the hum of the building around her, the weight of a photograph behind brown paper in a locker 30 meters down the hall. What kind of operational requirement? She said. He reached into his jacket and handed her a single folded page. She opened it. She read it. The color didn't leave her face, but something changed in her expression, something that an observer who didn't know her would not have been able to name, but that anyone who had spent enough time watching people absorb difficult information would have recognized immediately. It was the look of someone who had just understood that the last 2 weeks had been the smallest part of what was coming. It was the look of someone who had just understood that the last 2 weeks had been the smallest part of what was coming. She read the page twice, not because she hadn't understood it the first time, because the first time she understood it, and the second time she made sure she hadn't flinched from it, which were two different things. The operational requirement was a forward medical command post. Classified location. A joint special operations unit that had been running missions without adequate trauma medical leadership for 7 months because the person originally designated for the role had been medically separated after an injury sustained in training. The unit's casualty rate in that period had been manageable. Barely. The margin between manageable and catastrophic had been, according to the one paragraph of data on the page, a matter of positioning and luck, neither of which were resources Voss's program was willing to keep relying on. They needed a medical lead who could function at the operator level, who could make trauma decisions in the field under the same conditions the operators worked under, who had the clinical depth to handle what a forward position produced and the tactical background to understand the environment producing it. They needed, in short, exactly the person Claire Donovan had spent 7 years trying to be something other than. She folded the page along its original crease and held it. How many people are in the unit? She said. 14, Voss said. Currently deployed in rotation. The forward post handles their medical support and the medical support of allied elements in the operational area. 7 months without adequate coverage. Yes. She looked at the folded page in her hand. Someone made that decision, to deploy without filling the medical lead position. Voss's expression didn't change. Yes. That decision had a name attached to it. It did. And that person is no longer in a position to make that kind of decision, Voss said. That's one of the things the program restructure addresses. She stood with that for a moment. 14 people operating for 7 months with a gap at the center of their medical support, because someone above them had made a call that prioritized the mission timeline over the margin of safety. 14 people who had gotten through it by luck and positioning. She thought about Kwan on the gurney, oxygen saturation dropping, about 4 millimeters between Hargrove and a different outcome, about the specific arithmetic of close calls, how they accumulated, and what happened when the luck ran out. She handed the page back to Voss. Monday, she said, that's when you'll have your answer. She held his gaze. I said Monday. He took the page. He nodded. She walked back to the ER. 1. She spent the weekend doing what she'd always done with decisions that mattered. She didn't talk about them. She ran the Saturday shift, covered a gap in Sunday's overnight when a colleague called in sick, and somewhere in the space between a laceration repair and a post-op check, she made the decision, not dramatically, not in a single moment, but the way most real decisions happen, incrementally, one honest question at a time. Did she want this? She'd been honest enough with herself for long enough to know the answer wasn't simple. There was a part of her that had come to Iron Ridge specifically to be something quieter, to work in a building with heat and lights, and colleagues whose names she knew, to manage problems that had solutions, to sleep in the same place most nights. She had built 11 months of something that resembled a sustainable life, and she wasn't pretending that meant nothing. But there was another part of her, the part that had stood in Bay 3 Friday evening reading a page about 14 people and a 7-month gap. That didn't have a clean answer to the question of whether she could know what she knew and do something other than what she was being asked to do. She thought about what she'd told Pellew. I react. I just don't perform it. The decision was a reaction, a true one. She just needed to be sure before she named it. By Sunday night, she was sure. She called Voss at 21:40. He answered on the second ring. "Yes," she said. A pause. "Conditions still apply. All of them, plus one more." "Name it." "Bird comes with me, as unit medic. He's good, his concussion is fully resolved, and he's been operating in the wrong environment for his actual capability." She paused. "He deserves a better assignment." Voss was quiet for 3 seconds. "I'll make it work." "Then you have your answer." She hung up. She sat on the edge of her bed in her off-post apartment for a few minutes in the quiet. The heater clicked. Outside, Silver Creek was dark and cold and still. She looked at the ceiling and let herself have the feeling, not the performed version, not the managed version, but the actual one, which was complicated and not entirely comfortable, and was also, underneath all of that, something that felt like standing on solid ground. Then she went to sleep. The final board findings were made public within the installation on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the review convened. Public in this context meant posted to the installation's internal command network and read aloud at the morning command briefing that all unit leaders attached to Iron Ridge were required to attend. Claire was not present for the reading. She was in the ER, where she had chosen to be, running a shift that needed running. But Marcus came to find her at 09:30 with the expression of a man who had been sitting on something good for 20 minutes and was about to put it down. He handed her a printout. She read it standing at the nurse's station, same as she'd read the preliminary findings 3 weeks before. The full board report was 11 pages. The summary that had been posted and read aloud was 3 paragraphs, and those 3 paragraphs did something that the preliminary findings had gestured toward but not fully named. They named it now. The pattern of conduct by the attached Special Operations Unit was described, in the formal language of military administrative findings, as a sustained campaign of professional harassment directed at nursing and medical staff, compounded by retaliatory complaint filing, deliberate obstruction of clinical protocol, and, in Tuckerman's case, criminal interference with a federal medical facility's administrative systems. The findings stated that the conduct had been documented in real time by the affected staff with a thoroughness that the board described, in language that was as close to plain speech as military administrative documents ever got, as exemplary in its precision and completeness. That last phrase had Claire's name beside it in a footnote. The consequences were enumerated publicly. Tuckerman, court-martialed, discharged, facing federal charges that carried a sentencing range that made the specific number irrelevant. He was gone, completely and permanently, from any role that touched the people and systems he had tried to manipulate. Hargrove. Formal reprimand and permanent record, 90-day suspension, mandatory retraining designated as a condition of return to deployment status. The remaining unit members. Individual reprimands, suspended deployment status, mandatory retraining cycle to be completed before any further operational assignment. The retraining program had an instructor assigned. The summary listed the instructor's name and her current title, which was, as of the Monday prior, when Voss's paperwork had cleared the final approval chain, Lead Battlefield Trauma Instructor, Joint Special Operations Medical Command, Iron Ridge Military Medical Center. Claire Donovan. Marcus watched her read that paragraph. She set the paper down on the desk. "Well," Marcus said. She didn't say anything for a moment. "They're going to hate it," she said. "The retraining, at least at first." Hargrove's team, reporting to the instructor they spent 2 weeks trying to dismantle. Marcus tilted his head. "Yeah, I think hate is probably in the range." "Good," she said simply. Then she picked up her stethoscope and went back to her rounds. The retraining began 4 weeks later. It began specifically at 0600 on a Monday in the installation's medical simulation facility, a building that smelled of disinfectant and controlled artificial urgency, fitted with high-fidelity mannequins and trauma scenarios that could be modulated in real time by whoever was running the program. Claire had spent the preceding 2 weeks redesigning the curriculum from its baseline. Not rebuilding it entirely, the baseline was adequate for standard purposes. She rebuilt the components that mattered for the specific failures she'd witnessed: triage decision-making under command pressure, the clinical authority of non-operator medical personnel in field environments, the specific behavioral protocols that governed how operators were expected to interact with medical staff in joint operational settings. She built an entire module around the consequences of ignoring a medic's assessment. She used Bird's concussion as the case study, anonymized. The irony was not subtle, and she didn't try to make it subtle. Hargrove's team came in at 0558, all 5 of them, 4 minutes early. She clocked it without commenting on it. They were in their training gear, not their dress uniforms, which was correct for the environment. They were quieter than she'd seen them in the ER in January. Not chastened exactly. Men like this didn't do chastened cleanly, but recalibrated, operating at a different frequency than they had 2 months ago. She ran them through the first scenario at 0601. She gave them a mass casualty setup, 5 casualties, mixed mechanisms, one presenting with a complex picture that required a specific and non-obvious intervention sequence. She put them in it and stepped back and watched what they did. What they did was not wrong. It was competent. It was the level of response you'd get from operators who had done the training and retained it and were executing under moderate stress. She stopped the scenario at the 8-minute mark. Ortega, she said. Bay 2. Walk me through your reasoning. Ortega walked her through it. His reasoning was sound as far as it went. You missed the respiratory pattern, she said. You had the right diagnosis on the fracture. You prioritized it correctly. And you missed the thing that would have killed him in 15 minutes while you were managing the thing that would have taken 45. She paused. Run it again. Hargrove looked at her from across the room, not with resistance, with the expression of someone recalibrating in real time. They ran it again. The second time they caught the respiratory pattern at the 4-minute mark. Better, she said. No elaboration. She loaded the next scenario. This was how it went. Not punishing, not theatrical, not designed to humiliate, just exacting. The same standard she applied to herself, applied to them, consistently, without adjustment for who they were or what they'd done. The work was the work. The expectation was the expectation. By the 3rd week, something had shifted in the room's atmosphere. Not dramatically. Just the specific shift that happens when people who are good at their jobs are being pushed past the ceiling of what they thought their jobs required, and they've started to clear that ceiling, and they can feel it. Pellew, who had been attached to a different unit pending his retraining completion, was present for week 4 as part of a cross-unit module. He was good, attentive, fast, with a genuine instinct for triage sequencing that she noted without saying so. After the week 4 session, he stopped her at the door. Can I ask you something? You can ask, she said. The call sign, Valkyrie 6, is that? He stopped. I heard something in the briefing on the appointment. I wasn't supposed to hear it. I'm not asking for details. She looked at him. I just want to know if any of it was real, he said. The things they were saying, what you did. Before, she studied him for a moment. All of it, she said. He nodded slowly. He seemed to be putting something down. Some last version of the story he'd been telling himself about who she was and where she'd come from. How do you go from that to this? To nursing? This isn't a step down from that, she said. This is the same work with different tools. She met his eyes. The objective is the same. Keep people alive. Everything else is just terrain. He stood with that. Get some sleep, she said. Week 5 is worse. He almost smiled. Yes, ma'am. Tuckerman's arraignment came down in the 5th week of the retraining cycle. Claire was not in the courtroom. She was at Iron Ridge running a morning ER shift before an afternoon training session, and she read the outcome on her phone during a 20-minute break between a shoulder dislocation and an incoming transfer from a highway accident. 7 counts, all 7 sustained. The federal judge had declined the defense's motion to reduce the credential fraud charge on the grounds that interference with a federal medical facility's controlled substance records was not a technical violation, but a direct attack on patient safety infrastructure, language that was precise and correct, and which Claire read twice. Sentencing in 3 weeks. The range the prosecution had put on record was not small. She put her phone in her pocket and went to manage the highway transfer. Hargrove was cleared for limited duty in the 6th week. Not deployment, not yet, and possibly not for some time, depending on how the remaining review elements resolved. But cleared for the training facility, cleared to be in the building and doing the work. He came to her office. She had an office now, a small one, with a window that faced the parking lot, on his first morning back. He knocked. She told him to come in. He sat in the chair across from her desk without being asked, which she noted as different from the first time he'd sat across from her anywhere. He looked better than he had in the hospital bed, still reduced from his pre-surgery baseline, still carrying the surgery in the way his body moved, but present in a way he hadn't been for a while. "I wanted to tell you something before the module starts," he said. She waited. "I've been going through the retraining materials. The curriculum?" He paused. "The case study in Module 3, the respiratory pattern, the missed diagnosis." He looked at her. "That's Bird." "It's an anonymized case study," she said. "Yes, ma'am." He held her gaze. "I put together who it was anyway." A pause. "You used my unit's mistake to build the training so the next unit doesn't make the same one. That's what case studies are for." He was quiet for a moment. "I spent a long time," he said slowly, "thinking that the way to be good at this work was to be harder than the situation, harder than the environment, harder than the people around you." He looked at his hands. "I'm starting to think that's a limited model." She looked at him. "It works until it doesn't," she said, "and then it fails in ways that cost other people." He nodded, not defensively, just taking it in. "I don't know if I can be a different kind of leader than I've been," he said. It was one of the more honest things she'd heard anyone say in a long time. "You don't have to know yet," she said. "That's what the retraining is for." He stood. At the door he stopped, same as he'd stopped at Bay 2's curtain the night she'd saved his life when he'd told her he was sorry about the mug. "The things I said in January," he said, "about nurses, about what this job was." He didn't finish it. "I know," she said. "No, I want to say it right." He turned around. "You're the best medical officer I've ever worked with. I've worked with a lot of them." He held her gaze. "I'm sorry it took me this long to see what was in front of me." The office was quiet. "Use it going forward," she said. "That's how it means something." He nodded. He left. She sat for a moment in the quiet of the office. The parking lot outside the window was gray and still, the last of the winter giving way to an early spring that Montana offered reluctantly. The heater clicked. Somewhere down the hall, the training facility was being set up for the morning session. She thought about something she'd read once, in a different life, in a context that felt very far from a small office in Silver Creek. The most dangerous assumption in any environment is that the person in front of you is what they look like from the outside. She had been the person they'd misjudged. She was honest enough to admit, done her own version of it, had looked at Pellew and seen only the unit he belonged to, had categorized Hargrove before she had his full picture. Nobody in this story had been entirely clean. That was the uncomfortable part that didn't simplify, no matter how clearly the right and wrong of it had eventually sorted out. What mattered was what you did with the gap between who someone appeared to be and who they actually were. Whether you let the gap remain, or whether you did the harder thing of closing it. The formal appointment ceremony was small. Claire had specified that inner conditions, and Voss had honored it. No auditorium, no installation-wide gathering, no ceremony designed to be photographed and distributed. A conference room on the 2nd floor, the one with the window that looked out over the training grounds, with the people who had been part of the record present and no one else. Mercer read the official citation. It was factual and appropriately brief. It named her appointment, its scope, its effective date. It noted her continued role at Iron Ridge ER. It did not reference her operational history by name or by call sign, which was what she'd asked for and what the classification level of that history required anyway. When Mercer finished, he looked at her. "Anything you'd like to say?" he asked. She stood in the front of the room, Voss to one side, the director on the other. Stroud near the back, which Claire had specifically requested. Marcus beside her, which Stroud had apparently decided was not a request she needed to wait for. Pellew in the 2nd row. Bird beside him. Bird, whose transfer to the joint program had been processed the prior week, who had come to her office to say thank you and then stood there clearly having more to say and been unable to organize it. She'd told him, "Just be as good as I know you can be. That's the thank you I want." He'd nodded, in the way people nod when they're being handed something they intend to earn. She looked at the room now. "I'm not good at speeches," she said. "I'll keep this short." She paused. "I came to this facility 11 months ago, and I did my job," she said. "I did it the same way I'd always done it, as well as I could in the conditions I was given. When those conditions included people who were determined to make the work harder than it needed to be, I documented the record and kept moving." She paused. "That's not heroism. That's just not giving the situation permission to make you worse than you are." She looked at the faces in the room. "What I want to say, the thing I actually believe, is that the people who go underestimated are rarely fragile. They're usually just quiet, and quiet gets mistaken for small." She let that sit for a moment. "It isn't small. It's a choice. And it costs something, and it's worth making anyway, because the alternative is performing yourself into something you're not for an audience that wasn't worth performing for." She looked at Stroud, who had been the first person to say, "I know," when Claire told her what was happening, and who had made calls and filed documents and fought the administrative version of the battle while Claire fought the clinical one. She looked at Marcus, who had grabbed her arm and told her the truth she hadn't wanted to hear and been right, and let her make the call anyway. She looked at Pellew, who was 22 years old and had done the harder thing. "Thank you," she said. "To the people in this room who saw clearly when it mattered, you know who you are." That was the speech. Mercer started to clap. The room followed. She let it go for 3 seconds, then she raised a hand and it stopped, because she had never been comfortable with applause directed at her, and she wasn't going to start now. "There's a training session at 1400, she said. "I'll see the relevant personnel there." She stopped at her locker before the afternoon session. She opened it, took out the stethoscope on the hook, which she didn't need to take because she had one in her office, but she took it anyway because it was the one she'd been using, and she was particular about her equipment. Behind it, the photograph. Brown paper still taped over it. She stood there for a moment. Then she peeled the paper off. She looked at the photograph, younger version of herself. Desert dust. 6 men grinning, her face flat and calm, looking directly at the camera. She looked at it for a long time. She didn't feel the need to describe what she felt. It wasn't a simple thing, and it wasn't a simple photograph, and the years between that image and this locker were not years she could compress into a clean narrative. People always want the story to be clean. The past you leave behind, the future you step into, the line between them straight and clear. Real lives don't have that line. They have a continuous thread that runs through everything, pulling all of it forward, whether you want it to or not. She was the woman in that photograph. She was also the nurse who had crouched on an ER floor in January picking up pieces of a broken coffee mug while men laughed. Both things were true simultaneously, and neither of them was the whole story. She put the photograph in her jacket pocket. She closed the locker. She walked down the corridor toward the training facility, stethoscope in hand, the way she walked every corridor. Not performing anything, not announcing anything, just moving with the settled purpose of someone who knows exactly where they're going and why. Outside the building's windows, March had finally made a real argument for itself. The training grounds were half clear of snow, the tire tracks in the mud evidence of the morning's work already done. Somewhere out there, 14 people in a forward position she hadn't been to yet were moving through a world that had been short one person for 7 months. That was ending now. And Claire Donovan, nurse, sniper, instructor, the woman every person in this building had eventually been forced to look at clearly, walked toward the rest of it. Not because she had been vindicated, though she had been. Not because the people who'd underestimated her had been held accountable, though they had. But because the work was real, and the need was real, and she was exactly who the moment required. She had always known that. Now, finally, so did everyone else.